Good evening, everyone. Good evening. My name is John Highbush. I have the honor of being the executive director of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute. Thanks for joining us. In honor of our men and women in uniform who defend our freedom around the world, if you please stand and join me for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Please be seated. Before we get started, there are a few people in the audience I'd like to make sure we recognize this evening. And we'll start with former Congressman Elton Gallegly and his wife Janice. Elton, Janice. And please welcome Karen Pence, the wife of Vice President Mike Pence. President Reagan's son, Michael. Where are you, Michael? And I have to introduce him. He came all the way from Virginia with his family, my college roommate, Mike Quinn, his wife, Betsy, and her father, Walter. Okay, I'd like to begin with a brief history lesson. It's only appropriate, given we find ourselves at a presidential library. Our Constitution explicitly states the oath of office for the President of the United States. But for other officers of the government, including the Vice President, the Constitution offers no instruction whatsoever about the oath required. Well, the first Congress stated that only senators could administer the oath to the Vice President. Then, a few months later, they changed their mind to give judges that ability. The oath itself has changed many times over the years, but the oath in use today for the Vice President has been around since 1884. You will be interested to know that our guest tonight took the oath as Vice President with his left hand resting on none other than President Reagan's own Bible. The very same Bible used when he took the oath of office in 1981 and 4 years later during the inaugural of 1985. The oath is brief. Here it is. I do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same, that I take this obligation freely, without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion, and that I will well and faithfully discharge the duties of the office on which I am about to enter. So help me God. So help me God. Those 4 words serve as a plea, as a prayer, as a reminder that immense pressure may be placed on the person in power, and that he or she can turn to a higher power to find the confidence and the courage to do what is right. And so, it is also these very words that make for an appropriate title of Vice President Mike Pence's new memoir, which hit the stands just a couple of days ago. They are especially fitting because Vice President Pence is a man of deep and abiding faith, and it has been faith that has helped him, his wife Karen, and the entire Pence family throughout their lives, and particularly through the challenging moments of public life. This is a book about that journey. It is a defense of the policies of the Trump and Pence administration, and definitely worth a read. It is also a memoir that reveals some new details about some important recent history, including the events of January 6th. And throughout it, Vice President Pence also offers insights for his party that take on new relevance and indeed new urgency following last week's election results and, some might well say, announcements made earlier this week. When Vice President Pence last spoke at the Reagan Library, it was in the summer of 2021. It was part of our Time for Choosing speaker series. With that series, we invite Republican leaders to offer their view on the right direction for the party if it is to be successful in the future. So, as we gather here this evening, it seems that the choice now facing the party is becoming even starker and probably more complicated. As a party, we need to get this right. And I am certain that the first piece of advice our speaker this evening would offer about the future is this: uphold your oath to the Constitution. So help you God. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming the 48th Vice President of the United States of America, Mike Pence. What an honor it is to have you with us tonight, Mr. Vice President.
The honor is mine, John. Thank you so very much.
I'd like to start with a story.
Reagan Presidential Library is a national treasure.
Yeah. Thank you. No problem. This is your stage. I like the story. There's a story in your book, Mr. Vice President, about your father. And boy, I thought it was so telling because, and I hope you will tell it to us, it's about when you came home with a whole batch of blue ribbons, first places for your speaking contests that you had won. And you put them down in front of your father, and then what happened?
Well, John, again, thank you for the hospitality, and Congressman Gallagher and Michael Reagan and the other honored guests who are here. It's a real joy to be with you all. This is my first book signing for So Help Me God.
Yeah.
And I had to do it at the Reagan Library. I love you bringing up my dad because while much of So Help Me God deals with my public life, my election to Congress in 2000 and the tumultuous years that would follow that. I was on Capitol Hill on 9/11. I write about that in the book. My efforts that would result in me emerging as a conservative leader in the House of Representatives, going home to Indiana to be governor of the state, and then also having the great privilege to be your vice president during some extraordinary years of accomplishment for the American people. And none of that would have been possible without my faith in God, my family, and the support and prayers of the American people. So let me just say from the outset, thank you for the privilege of serving as your vice president. It was the greatest honor in my life. But it's wonderful you brought up my dad. My dad grew up on the south side of Chicago. He was a fast-talking young man, enlisted in the Army, went into the Korean War, and came back and met my mom, and they followed work down to a small town in southern Indiana where I showed up. But my dad has been gone since 1988. But sometimes I have to remind myself that our 3 adult children never met my dad, because he continues to be such a great influence in my life. He's the best man I ever knew. And someone recently observed that he's the secret star of So Help Me God. And that blessed my heart. But that story you refer to says a lot about my dad and the way he raised my 3 brothers and 2 sisters and I. In the chapter entitled Climb Your Own Mountain, Dad had built a successful business in a small town, a gas station business. I actually worked at a gas station to help pay my way through college. I was a gas station attendant. And for the younger people in the room, we'll explain later what that was. But my dad was a man of strong faith. His most often repeated phrases were, "Not my will, but thine be done," and "Climb your own mountain," which was, he said to each one of his children, he said, I don't care what you do with your life, but I want you to strive every day to do your best. And the story you allude to, very thoughtfully, John, really captured that moment. I didn't excel greatly in sports in high school, but I had a lot of success in speech competitions. And I remember coming home from a oratorical contest with a fistful of blue ribbons. And I threw them on the kitchen table to Dad, and I told him I'd had a great day. And the great part about it was that I really hadn't tried that hard. I mean, I really just kind of phoned it in, if you get my point. And Dad looked up at me. I thought he'd be pleased that I came back with a fistful of ribbons, and he threw them back at me. And he said, "I don't want anything to do with those." And I said, "Why? What do you mean? I came in first." And he said, "No, you just told me you didn't do your best." He said, "All I ever want from you is to do your best." And every day of my life, I try and live up to that standard. That combat veteran, that dedicated father, dedicated husband. One of my favorite memories in the book about my dad was, as your vice president, one of my first international trips was to travel to Korea. And we were driving through the capital of Seoul. And they had billboards at the bus stations, didn't they? It said, "Welcome, Vice President Pence." And then right underneath it, it said, "And thank you, Lieutenant Ed Pence, for our freedom." Thank you, John.
Okay, now, one more story I'd like you to tell. I just fell in love with this story when I read it. And this one's about a fraternity brother that you had in college. And this is a born-again story, but I'd like you to tell the story about what he wore around his neck and how that affected you. Well, he's got this fraternity brother named John. I thought it was only appropriate because I thought, my gosh, it's like this man's a modern-day John the Apostle. But you remarked to him about what he was wearing.
Well, when I went off to college, I had really lost interest in the faith of my youth. I'd gained some notoriety among my peer group, and I was probably a typical 18-year-old young man, pretty full of myself. I'd been raised in a churched home. My family, it was church on Sunday, grace before dinner, but I lost interest in it. But when I went off to college, as I recount in So Help Me God, I started to meet some young men that seemed to have an ease in their life that I didn't have. And they called themselves simply Christians. They invited me to come to a fellowship group on campus at the little chapel. And I visited once, And as I write in the book, there were a fair number of pretty young ladies that came to that sort of thing, so I started coming back. But in that time, I began to have conversations with my friends, particularly John, who's now actually a pastor at a large Presbyterian church in Indianapolis to this day. And we'd have late night conversations like fraternity brothers will have, talking about God. And at one point I noticed that John wore a nice little gold cross around his neck. I asked him where he got it, and he said it was from a catalog back in the day when you could pick up the phone and order things over the phone. And I said to him, I just decided I was associating with these Christian people, and I thought, I was just going to be Christian too. And I said, as I recount in the book, I remember saying to John a couple different times, hey, remember, give me that catalog. I want to order one of those crosses that you wear. And one day in the cafeteria at the fraternity, as he was walking away, he turned around and said to me, I said, don't forget to give me that catalog. I want to get that cross. And he said, remember, Mike, you got to wear it in your heart before you wear it around your neck. And I felt in that moment that my mask had been pulled off. As I wrote in the book, I realized he could tell I was a phony. I was just posing. I was holding the form of Christianity, but didn't understand it, didn't know it. It would be a number of weeks later that I would travel with that same group of young people to an early Christian music festival in a place called Wilmore, Kentucky. And it was there listening to these new contemporary Christian musicians in a movement that began here in California. And I heard a preacher on Saturday night as a slight drizzle came down, and it was as though I heard for the very first time that God so loved the world that he sent his only begotten Son, that whoever might believe in him might not perish, but might have everlasting life. And I stood up, and I walked down, and I found a volunteer pastor, and I accepted Jesus Christ as my personal Lord and Savior, and it changed my life forever. It's the most important decision that I ever made. And his grace has sustained me ever since. I try and reflect what that's meant to me every day since that day in the rain. The second most important decision I ever made in my life was the day I asked Karen Whitaker to be my wife, and she is in the greatest evidence of God's grace in my life.
I've heard you a few times say, I'm a Christian, I'm a conservative, and a Republican.
In that order.
That's right. I just wonder, maybe you might say it was on January 6th. I don't know. It might have been another time in your life when you felt your faith was really tested.
Well, I would tell you the early in my faith walk, the hardest day for me was the day that Dad left us. I was in the middle of that very first campaign in 1988. Karen and I were driving around in our Pontiac Grand Prix. Little sign on the door we taped, Mike Pence for Congress. And as I recount in the book, I got a phone call to hurry to the hospital in Columbus. And I walked into the hospital, and there my brother Ed had his arm around my mom, and she just simply looked at me and said, Dad's gone. And that was the worst day of my life, by far. But I try and write in the book very candidly about how I worked through that in my faith. I dealt with it. I tried to be candid about growing from it. But For me, that was maybe the greatest challenge. Beyond all public responsibilities I've had and challenges we've had in the public square, there's nothing more important than family.
Yeah. Now, the way I read it, this was definitely a love at first sight with Karen. And, you know, most politicians, my wife and I are a team, you know, my wife this and that. But I get the feeling reading this book, there's not a piece of your life where your wife, Karen, and you're just like melded together. This is a really important relationship. That's the sense I get.
Well, I dedicated the book to Karen, the love of my life. And it's true from the bottom of my heart. But I will tell you, from the first time I met her, I thought she was extraordinary. I followed her out the back of a church where she was playing guitar in the group and told her I wanted to play in the guitar group. She pointed to a rather large man with a beard and said, well, he runs it. I just stuck my hand out and said, I'm Mike Pence. And she figured out that I wasn't interested in playing the guitar. But I met her, and she was actually teaching shop at a local private school. Had already worked her way through college, paid her way through college, studied as a school teacher, got a master's degree. She was a pilot. She was in every way extraordinary to me. I write in the book that after I talked to this girl I just met for 15 minutes, I went and found an old college friend and talked about her for 3 hours. And to this day, he tells people he knew this time was different. And it was.
Yeah.
We were engaged 9 months later, married 9 months after that. And every step of the way, she has been my closest advisor, my greatest source of strength. My wife's faith has really sustained us through extraordinary times. And someone said to me the other day that what comes through in So Help Me God is that's it's not just our marriage, but it extended to our children all the way through a fateful day in January, now almost 2 years ago, when I was trying to find just the right words when we reconvened the United States Senate after that tragic day in January. And I was back upstairs just off the Senate chamber, and I'd written some words that I wanted to recite when we reconvened that very same day. And as you'll see and read in the book, my wife was over one shoulder, my daughter Charlotte was leaning over another. You know, my wife and kids know my heart better than anybody. And we had my son and my other daughter on the phone, giving their thoughts about helping Dad find just the right words. So I hope in this book what comes through is that whatever we've accomplished, whatever we've been able to do for the people of Indiana or the American people, we've been able to do because of our faith in God, my extraordinary wife, and our extraordinary family at the foundation of it all.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, speaking of family, I'd like to kind of broaden this out a bit and talk with you for a minute. You know, there's so many problems I'm sure you faced as governor, societal problems, and it ranges from drug abuse to homelessness. You know, these are intractable problems that it always seems are impossible to solve. But I get the sense in your book that you believe at the end of the day, we can throw any kind of money or programs at these things. It all begins and ends with the family.
Mm-hmm. Well, I was asked last night on a cable network program. Thank you. Some of you mentioned to me earlier. I was asked by a pastor from Indiana that was at the town hall on CNN. He said, what's your advice to busy families that have busy lives, which is virtually true of every American family in these challenging times? And I said, go home for dinner. You know, the family is the cornerstone of our civilization. It's, and I really do believe on a practical level, for in these times where it seems like our politics is more divided than ever, it's really more that unites the American people. And I believe faith is chief among those things, but I believe love for our families, a desire to see our children and our grandchildren live the American dream, achieve more than we achieved. And so I do believe that. Strong families make strong communities. Strong communities will make a strong America. And with strong families, there's nothing that we can't accomplish as Americans.
Yeah. Now, I told the story when I introduced you about you taking the oath with President Reagan's Bible. And you know, Ronald Reagan had a lot of fans. But
I was one of them.
Yeah. But my sense is that you not only really admired the man, but you admired his vision above all else. Is that right?
Admire his
vision.
Well, I know I'm in California, and California claims Ronald Reagan, and you should. But he's from the Midwest. I'm just saying, Mike. Not far from where I grew up.
Yeah.
It was his vision, but also, to me, it was that combination of a strong backbone and a gentle hand that inspired me. And as I recount in So Help Me God, I was slow to the parade. You know, I grew up in really a non-political family, if you can believe that. My dad really didn't have any use for either politicians or lawyers, so you can imagine I'm a source of great pride to him. But when I got interested in politics, I talked to Dad, and he said, well, my lawyer's involved in politics, go talk to him. Happened to be a Democrat. So I got involved in the Democratic Party in Bartholomew County, Indiana. I was the Youth Democrat Party coordinator in 1975, kind of a community organizer, if the truth be told. And I'll be honest with you, you know, as some of the people were teasing me after I arrived at the library today, I voted for Jimmy Carter. And I didn't get Ronald Reagan. I didn't understand it. But when I went off to college, embraced my faith in Christ, as I recount in the book, I began kind of a conservative transformation as well. I started hearing in President Reagan the same things that my Irish immigrant grandfather had raised me to believe. I was named after him. And that my dad had raised me to believe. Just that common sense, heartland conservatism that was just the vocabulary of my youth. You know, I always loved that story of, you know, when the American people heard Ronald Reagan talking, whether they were driving a truck or in an office or sitting on a tractor, they would just say, darn right. And I started to listen. And I started to hear that vision. But also, I was deeply inspired by that kindness and respect that he showed for every American. And when I moved to Indianapolis after I graduated, I literally, as I recount in the book, I walked into the local Republican headquarters and said, I'm here to sign up for the Republican Party. And this rather large county chairman looked at me behind his desk and said, Well, it's not really something you sign up for, but we're glad to have you. But I joined the Reagan Revolution and never looked back. And but it was his vision, a vision for a strong national defense, limited government under the Constitution, traditional moral values. But also it was a heart and a gentleness, and the way that he spoke, deep conviction, but gentleness and respect, that will always inspire me as long as I live, the life and the work and the example of Ronald Reagan.
Yeah. You just mentioned, in talking about the vision of Ronald Reagan, smaller government. Whatever happened to Republicans in smaller government and less spending?
I try and capture that a little bit. You know, I ran for Congress the first time in 1988 when President Reagan was still in the White House. And I lost. And I ran again in 1990. And I lost by more. And I really thought my political career was over. We would spend 10 years in radio and a little bit of television in the state of Indiana. But when the opportunity came back around to run for office, I dusted off that Reagan vision, that Reagan agenda. Karen and I loaded up the kids in the minivan. We went to the county fairs. We knocked on doors, and we were elected to Congress in the year 2000. And when I arrived on Capitol Hill, the very first bill I was handed, the new incoming Republican administration, was called No Child Left Behind. And it was the largest expansion of the Federal Department of Education since Jimmy Carter created it. Sometimes I felt like a Minuteman who showed up 10 years late for the revolution. Or I'd often tell friends that I felt like, Rip Van Winkle. I, went to sleep before the Reagan Revolution was over, and or when it started, and I woke up after it was over. And so I was one, and Elton Gallagher sitting here, who was a principled conservative every single day of his service in the Congress of the United States. Elton, I want to thank you so much for being such a great man. I was one of, I think, 28 Republicans that voted against No Child Left Behind. I voted against efforts by a Republican president to expand entitlements. But I had a deep sense, as I recount in So Help Me God, that if we walked away from that Reagan vision of limited government and fiscal responsibility, that the American people would walk away from us. And in 2006, they did. The majorities that we minted in 1994, we would lose in 2006. And I would say at the time, we didn't just lose the election, we lost our way. But we found our way back. I was the House Republican Conference chairman the last time we retired Nancy Pelosi, and in just a few short weeks, we'll retire her once and for all. But the key in 2010, and I believe the key in 2022, but was hewing back to those roots. I really do believe that as I said at the Reagan Library last year, that the foundations of our movement, from Reagan to Trump, are all grounded in the same principles, the same ideals of a strong and unwavering national defense. A commitment to the limited government described in the Constitution of the United States, a defense of all the liberties enshrined there, and then a commitment to protecting our liberties and our traditional values through the courts of the land. So I really have sought to put all that into practice in the course of my career, and I try and capture that story as a conservative journeying through years in Congress and the governorship, and as your vice president in the book.
One of the hallmarks of Ronald Reagan's success is, in addition to the importance of, Mrs. Reagan, family, but he was known for surrounding himself with really talented people. Jim Baker, Mike Deaver, Ed Meese, the names go on. I get the sense that you have that same talent. Guys like Nick Ayers, Mark Short, Kellyanne Conway, you have really been able to build a world-class team.
Well, thank you. And Mark Short and his wife, Kristen. Mark is with us tonight. Actually, we're the founding executive directors of the Reagan Ranch.
Yeah.
So they come from good background. But it's one of the things that you learn early on, and I know President Reagan learned it and lived it. I've had the privilege to know a number of people that were senior in the administration, including a dear friend, Attorney General Ed Meese, whose friendship I cherish to this day. You learn early on you're only as good as your people. And, I learned that on that tragic day in January in 2021 as well. Both Mark Short and my general counsel, Greg Jacob, as I recount in the book, had been there at my side, giving me steady counsel and support as we sought to stand firm and to do our duty. And I'll always believe that we did our duty that day, ensuring the peaceful transfer of power under the Constitution of the United States and the laws of this country. When it was all over at 4 in the morning, I stepped down off the rostrum, and I had a number of members of Congress that were approaching me, graciously thanking me for what we'd done and the stand that we'd taken. But there was only one person I was looking for. I walked out into the speaker's lobby. I tended to ignore the members that were expressing kindness to me, and there she was at the far end of the lobby, my wife Karen. And I walked up, put my arms around her, and she looked up at me and said, "I'm proud of you." And it was all I needed to hear. But as we walked out of the building, I realized I'd lost track of my chief of staff, a man who I literally worked with for 10 years. He was my chief of staff when I was the conference chairman for House Republicans. We had stayed close during my years as governor, and he worked in the White House in various roles, ultimately as my chief. And so I just got out my phone as we were walking to the limousines in those early morning hours of January 7th, and I just typed to Mark. I said, "Thank you for everything." I said, "I lost track of you." And he simply wrote back a Bible verse, 2 Timothy 4:7. And we climbed into the limousines, and as we slowly began to pull away from the Capitol, I looked it up. It reads, "I fought the good fight. I finished the race. I kept the faith." Those are the kind of people I've been privileged to have around me, John.
Yeah, you bet. You bet. Now, speaking of that motorcade, early the next morning, you tell a really interesting tale about how you were thinking of what was happening on January 6th, because I know the Secret Service, Capitol Police, the whole world is urging you, leave the Capitol for your own safety, get out, get out. And you told them something about this 16-car motorcade. Can you relay that to the audience tonight?
I was on the Senate floor when, as I write in my book, the parliamentarian turned around and said that rioters have breached the first floor of the Capitol on the House side. "Just informing you," she said. We continued the proceedings where we were hearing discussion of objections that had been brought under the Electoral Count Act. And a few moments later, one of my Secret Service agents, a wonderful man named Maximilian, came walking up to my chair on the Senate floor and said, "We got to go." And I got out of my chair, and as we walked toward the door, he said, "We need to get you out of the building. There's rioters on the House side." And I must tell you, I served for 12 years in the House of Representatives. I had great confidence in the Capitol Hill Police. I was there when the Majority Leader's office was attacked by a gunman that claimed lives. I had every confidence the Capitol Hill Police would have the situation in hand, and I looked at Max and said, "We'll just wait in my office across the hall from the Senate chamber." And so there we went, and my wife Karen joined me quickly, Charlotte joined me, and we began to monitor on a small television set what was happening, and I really couldn't believe what I was seeing. And I was filled with indignation at the sights of people smashing windows and ransacking offices. I was angry. I thought, not this, not here, not in America. The Secret Service agent came in again and said, "Sir, we've got to leave the building." And I said, "We're fine, we'll stay here." I wasn't leaving my post. And a few minutes later, they came back in and they were more insistent and said, we need to leave the building. And I stuck my finger in our lead agent's chest. And I said, "You're not hearing me." I said, "I'm not leaving." I said, "I'm not giving those people the sight of a 16-car motorcade speeding away from the Capitol." And he looked at me with some anxiety and said, "Well, you can't stay here. This is a glass door. We can't secure it." And with a nudge from my daughter, he offered that we could go to the loading dock a few floors down that was still secure. And I agreed. But as we made our way down the stairs, we could hear the sound of footfall. We could hear the noise of a crowd in the hallways. But arriving in the loading dock, they began to walk me toward the cars. So the motorcade was kind of lined up on the ramp going out of the underground parking garage. The doors were both open. And I stopped and looked at my lead agent, a wonderful, courageous man named Tim Giebels, and said, "I'm not getting in the car." And he said, "No, sir, we're just going to hold here. We're going to stay. We're just going to have you wait in the car, but we're staying here." And I looked at him and I said, with great sincerity, I said, "Tim, you're a man of integrity, but you're not driving that car." And I just knew in my heart, after 4 years under Secret Service protection, there was a high likelihood that once Karen and I got in that car and closed those 200-pound doors, somebody was going to tell that driver to go, because that was their job. Was. And I looked at Tim and I said, "Is this area secure?" He said, "It is for now." And I said, "Well, then we're here." And we stayed. I was absolutely convinced that that it was important that I stay at my post. I thought it was important that I stay in the Capitol and do whatever I could to assist the response by Capitol Police, by federal law enforcement, even by the Pentagon, to square it away. And I must tell you that they did it because of the extraordinary courage of law enforcement, Capitol and federal. The violence was quelled. We were able to reconvene the Congress the very same day and complete our work under the Constitution, and a day of tragedy became a triumph of freedom. and I'll never see it any other way. I said on the Senate floor, John, that in my brief remarks that I recount in the book, today the world will witness the resilience of our democracy. And they did. And I'll always be grateful for the support of the members of Congress, House and Senate, in both political parties that completed their duty that day. And I must tell you, over the last 2 years, as I've traveled around the country, and even here tonight, it's deeply meaningful for me to hear the encouragement and support of people all across this country. And I want to thank you all for that from the bottom of my heart.
Okay, we got time for maybe one or two more questions. And I on this January 6th situation, I know that President Trump has really taken his licks. You know, I mean, impeached twice. You know, at the same time, you and he as a team accomplished a phenomenal amount. So I'd like to end on that high note, a optimistic, a positive note. Can you just talk about, you know, what's your proudest accomplishment from the Trump-Pence administration? There's a lot.
Well, John, thank you. And when I wrote So Help Me God, I wrote about lessons learned early in my life. I wrote about challenges at the end of this season of my public career. But I hope people that take a look at this book also see that it's been described as the most fulsome defense of the record of the Trump-Pence administration that's in print. Because I couldn't be more proud to have been vice president in an administration that rebuilt our military, rolled back taxes and regulation, created 7 million good-paying jobs. Unemployment was at a 50-year low. We unleashed American energy and became a net exporter of energy for the first time in 70 years. We secured our southern border and reduced illegal immigration by 90%. And we appointed more than 300 conservatives to our federal courts at every level, including Justice Neil Gorsuch, Justice Brett Kavanaugh, and Justice Amy Coney Barrett. And that conservative majority gave America a new beginning in the right to life in the last 6 months. To me, it was a privilege to be a part of it, and I also appreciate the fact, something else I tried to capture in So Help Me God was the hailstorm of opposition that we faced from day one. I tell a story in the book about how I was with President Trump on Inauguration Day 2017, and we were in the Oval Office, and just the two of us were there, and we started walking back to the White House down the portico. And the bright Klieg lights were on the side wall. It was well lit. And President Trump looked at me and said, look at this. And I said, it's humbling. And he turned and looked at me and said, that's right, it's humbling. But as we walked into the residence, the end of that chapter, I capture the fact that back outside the Oval Office was a stack of newspapers. The headline in the Washington Post on January 20th, 2017 was, "The campaign to impeach Donald Trump starts today." And they never let up. 2.5 years of the Russia hoax until it was no collusion, no obstruction, case closed. They impeached that president for a phone call. and the unrelenting attacks by Democrats and their allies in the media was the likes of which I had never seen. I was a young man in the Reagan years, and it was no picnic for Ronald Reagan. I get it. And I don't know if it was the advent of the internet or social media or cable television that amplified it. But men and women, I mean to tell you, it was like nothing I'd ever seen in my life. But nevertheless, we accomplished things that conservatives have been talking about for generations. And we did it all in 4 short years. Somebody asked me the other day if I have any regrets, and I speak about that at the close of the book. The only regret I have is seeing virtually all the progress that we made dismantled over the last 2 years. A military that was more robust than at any time since the Reagan years now is facing flatlining of their budgets and shortages once again. And a political correctness that seems to be echoing down the halls of the Pentagon. An economy that was ready to rebound after the worst pandemic in 100 years, saddled with a mountain range of spending and debt that's ignited the worst inflation in 40 years. A war on energy waged against an America that had achieved energy independence that's caused gasoline prices to go through the roof. And a border that was secure the day we left, now facing millions of people coming across the border with suffering on both sides of the border in the worst crisis that we've ever witnessed. Add to that the trampling on our freedoms and our liberties and our values on a regular basis. But all that being said, if I learned anything in those Trump-Pence years is the capacity of the American people to make things right and to do it quickly. I mean, if you think in not 4 years, but in the 3 years before that pandemic, all that we accomplished for the American people, I want to give people encouragement that with the right leadership that starts in the House of Representatives in just a few short weeks, and with the right leadership ultimately in the Senate and at the under end of Pennsylvania Avenue, I know that what we did before we'll do again. My faith in the American people and our Constitution will always be boundless. And I truly do believe that the day will come, and it'll come someday soon, that we have government as good as our people again. As principled, as committed, as compassionate, as courageous. And when that day comes, we'll set America on a course to a boundless future. You know, there's 2 paintings in the book, for those of you that are among the 600 people I signed books for tonight. Thank you. Thank you. Karen and I were humbled by that. But if you look in the inside jacket of the book, there's 2 paintings, John. One is a painting that was in my office outside the United States Senate. It's by an artist from Indiana named T.C. Steele. He was the leading landscape artist in Indiana about a century ago. It's a painting of a little winding road taking back into the woods, and I capture it at the outset of the book. After a tumultuous day in January of 2021, I used that painting as a way of going back to Indiana and beginning to tell my story. But at the end of the book, you'll find another painting, also by T.C. Steele. It hung in my office in the West Wing for all 4 years. And it's a classic Indiana horizon, rolling hills and trees, a vista as far as the eye can see. And then there's a slight tint in the clouds. And as I write at the end of So Help Me God, Some people saw that painting and wondered what time of day it captured. Was it dawn or dusk? But I never wondered. It's dawn. Because the sun is always rising in America. So help us God. Thank you, John.
Mr. Vice President, on behalf of every single person here, we are so honored to have you this evening. Thank you, and God bless you.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the 48th Vice President of the United States. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated as our special guest and party exits the building.